Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm Damian Wetzel. I'm the director of the Aspen Institute Arts Program, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's roundtable, one in a long series that we've been doing here about how the arts are informing and improving society in all kinds of different ways. And this is a discussion that's been much anticipated, just as this project we're going to discuss has been much anticipated. Coming from New York and watching how the High Line has changed that entire part of the city, and in turn changed development practices with unused infrastructure around the country and around the world, has been an incredibly exciting, I would say, decade of watching that happen. We had Liz Diller here, who pioneered that work on the High Line, and now we're here to talk about the 11th Street Bridge project, which goes one step further, I have to say. Just to step on the territory, just to kick it off, it does a lot more than take a piece of infrastructure and make it a place people want to be and change the neighborhood around it, which is what the High Line does, and it had an enormous economic impact. And this is about connecting communities as well, taking it to an entirely different place. I've done quite a bit of work in schools in Anacostia through the Turnaround Arts program of the President's Committee on Arts and Humanities. So I've been to that area and seen young people and seen isolation, if you will. And what this does is look that square in the face and say, how can this be something else? How can this be better? And then it's our jobs to take that and bring that to reality. But first, we have to build it, and then we can come, as the movie said. So I'm going to turn this over to my friend Phil Kennicott, who has graciously offered, and he'll explain why in some ways, to moderate this. Phil has done quite a bit of interesting work with the Aspen Institute Arts Program, looking at issues about veterans in arts and arts in prisons. And this takes it quite close to home, as he'll say. So Phil, I'm going to turn it over to you and introduce the rest of the panel, but I want to thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to this as well.
Thank you, Damian. Well, first, let me introduce our panel today. To my right is Scott Kratz, who is the director of the 11th Street Bridge project. Scott gave up a good bit of gainful employment to take on what is really one of the most exciting, kind of high-risk, great-to-be-gained projects. It's something I'm very excited about, and he can tell us a little bit about that after we get started. And then to my immediate left is Jason Long, and to his left, Hallie Boyce, who are co-lead designers on the project, Hallie with OLIN and Jason with OMA, the architecture firm that won a competitive process to create the design for the 11th Street Bridge Park. So Damian was alluding to my vested interest in this. As a critic, of course, I make all of my judgments and opinions on only the most sound design principles. Nothing ever untoward enters into my calculations. But I do happen to live on Capitol Hill, and this bridge is very exciting to me. Because if you live near one of the rivers in Washington for any amount of time, you realize how strange our relationship to these rivers is. We're not Paris or London or Shanghai, where the river is a major sort of aesthetic organizing principle of the city. We seem to be sort of accidentally located at the confluence of rivers. It isn't, of course, an accident. There was a good historical reason for why we're here. But in the way that the city was designed, it's often as if the rivers weren't really even there, except for an occasional postcard view of the Potomac River. And that's even more the case for the Anacostia River, which is our great, exciting, forgotten river. When people visit me from out of town, if they show even the least interest in seeing that part of Washington, which is not the mall, and the museums and the great memorials, I take them across the Anacostia, where there's just a wealth of cultural and historic resources. It's where Frederick Douglass's house is. It's where the aquatic gardens are. There are a couple of new library designs by David Adjaye, who's doing the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture on the mall. But he also did these wonderful little libraries that are in neighborhoods that aren't necessarily highly trafficked by tourists. You can spend days and days exploring that part of the river, and yet people don't. And it's simply a matter of the psychological divide that the Anacostia has created in Washington. That's why this project is so exciting, because it bridges that divide, not just architecturally, but culturally, and maybe even in terms of economics, demographics, health, environment, a whole range of issues, which we'll get to today. I thought we should probably give you a sense of actually what this thing is before we start. So let me turn to our panelists to give a brief introduction from each of their individual points of view about the project. So Scott, tell us, what is the 11th Street Bridge and what will it do, and how far are we from seeing it open?
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Damien, for hosting us today. One of the exciting things about being here at the Aspen Institute is that the Aspen Institute cares deeply about ideas that shape our cities and shape our culture. And we think that the 11th Street Bridge Park is an opportunity to manifest those ideas into something real, into something tangible, into something that we can look and taste and touch. So first, the 11th Street Bridge Park is a project of the Congress Heights-based nonprofit, and appropriately named, I should add, Building Bridges Across the River at the Arc. We have 3 board members here today, Ann and Karen and Rona. And we are collaborating with the DC government on this project, working most closely with the DC Office of Planning and the DC Department of Transportation, or DDOT. And the project began about 3.5 years ago with then Director of the Office of Planning, Harriet Tregoning, and one of her staff, Patricia Zingsheim, who I think is going to be here in a little bit today, who saw this unique opportunity where old bridges had aged out and needed to be replaced. And how do we look at this as a new opportunity, instead of getting rid of all of the old infrastructure, to transform that infrastructure into a new civic space that can support the region's physical, economic, cultural, environmental health? So Harriet spent the first about 6 months getting everybody on board that we knew we'd need to get on board, mayor and sister agencies, federal government. Everyone said, wow, this is a really amazing opportunity. And then I began the volunteering at first, spending 2 years listening with the community, asking really 2 questions. One, is this something that the community wants in the first place? I think that's really critically important. And to date, we've heard nothing but enthusiastic responses. And 2, just as important, what kind of programming can we put on the bridge, this future civic space, that can meet the needs of the community? So if you take nothing else away from this presentation today, know that every single programming idea that we're about to see has been driven by the community. This has been a community-driven project from the beginning. And to date, I was counting yesterday, we've had a little shy of 500 meetings with members of the community. I've been counting. I've got a journal at home. I think up to 480 something, but and that's really critically important. So what I thought I'd do very briefly, and then I'll turn it to Jason and Hallie, is describe physically where this park is, our key goals, and then Jason and Hallie can talk a little bit about the design, and then we can get into some of the conversation. So first, the bridges, connect over the Anacostia River, the neighborhoods of Capitol Hill and historic Anacostia, where you can see the sort of red lines that are wrapped around it. 2 bridges were built in the 1960s, reached the end of their lifespan, needed to be replaced. This is the largest government project in its history, something like $394 million. I'm looking at Stephen Moon, who's here from Skanska. And Ficina helped build this. What you're looking at, this is probably the most helpful of what we're trying to showcase what we're trying to accomplish. What you're looking at, in frame of reference here, the U.S. Navy Yard is off to the bottom left-hand corner. The Anacostia Park is off to the right. Historic Anacostia is just off to the far right. Thank you, Jason. This is a picture of the old spans and the new spans on a single image. So the light gray and the orange spans at the top and the bottom, those are the old spans of the bridge. Those were built between 1962 and 1967. Those were replaced with not 2, but 3 new bridges. The 2 dark gray bands at the top are freeway bridges, so you now don't have to, you now can go north on 295, which you couldn't do before. But we're most interested in the bridges to the bottom. The dark gray band at the bottom is the new local bridge that opened up about 16, 17 months ago. And two things to point out about the local bridge is that it has a 16-foot wide pedestrian and bike path on there that's already done a really nice job of connecting both sides of the river. And we see transforming part of that orange span, the downstream span, into this new civic space that can link to that 16-foot wide pedestrian and bike path in a contiguous line, so you could be walking or biking up from the Navy Yard or from the baseball stadium or Yards Park, zip over to the 11th Street Bridge Park, and then continue going to historic Anacostia or vice versa. And two, and this has certainly been in the news a lot of late, but the DDOT presciently built the new 11th Street local bridge to hold the streetcar. Ooh, I know. And so as the streetcar, if the streetcar moves forward, that streetcar will go across the 11th Street local bridge. And right now, currently, there's major trunk lines, the bus lines that go across it, the 90, the 92, the circulator. And I say all of this because it's key that this bridge park is deeply connected to both sides of the river, that it's deeply stitched into the adjacent neighborhoods. It's something we've been thinking a lot about. So the last image that I'll talk about is this image. This is the old orange span that you saw on the previous slide. We thought that the green deck on top had a beautiful industrial patina to it. Most people thought it was really hideous. It was really ugly. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But I've learned more about bridge engineering than I ever thought I would know working on this project. And it turns out that saving the deck would have been cost prohibitive. So the deck has been removed. But one of the other things that I learned is that one of the most expensive parts about building any bridge, particularly a river bridge, is that one of the most expensive parts about building a river bridge is, yes, the deck, but more importantly, it's the piers that hold all the load, that hold all that live load and dead load. The piers are in great shape. So we're going to be reusing the old piers to build a new deck on top, but one that no longer has to hold cars, but that can hold the community-inspired programming ideas of environmental education center, performance space, urban agriculture, public art that tells the rich history of the region, intergenerational play space, and kayak and canoe launches on the river below. And so we took all of those programming ideas and we launched a nationwide design competition, asking some of the best landscape architects and architects in the country to manifest these community-driven programming ideas into a design that we can look and taste and touch. You never know if you throw a party, is anybody going to show up? But we had over 250 firms register, over 80 firms formally apply. The community was engaged at every step of the way. And at the end, the most amazing thing happened where our group of community stakeholders was unanimous, our group of official jury was unanimous, and even 1,100 people who filled out an online survey, well, they weren't unanimous because that would have looked weird. But they gave the highest marking to the design by OMA and OLIN. And it has been such a treat working with Jason and Hallie on this project that supports our 4 key goals of this project, which is supporting public health, re-engaging with the river, being a metaphorical and physical bridge between disconnected communities, and being an anchor for economic development. So with that, Jason.
Thanks, Scott. I'm Jason Long. I'm a partner at OMA, and you were already introduced to Hallie from OLIN. This is a map showing our 2 firms. We're often collaborating together. We're originally headquartered in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, but we're running this project out of our New York office. We also have offices in Hong Kong and also Dubai. And OLIN is headquartered out of Philadelphia. So both of us are actually very close to DC and have actually, especially in Hallie's case, a lot of experience with DC. OMA is largely known for our public projects, both in the United States and elsewhere. This is just a few of them: the Seattle Central Library, the D. and Charles Wiley Theater in Dallas, Milstein Hall at Cornell University, and the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Quebec City, which is under construction right now. A lot of these projects, like another project in Santa Monica that we're working on together with OLIN, work to try to use structure and landscape to bridge a divide between built form and the urban environment, or between the public and nature. One example of that is actually the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Quebec, which is a building that actually steps out over towards the city from an existing park, creating a cantilever, which is a kind of bridge to nowhere, you could say, But here we use that structure to frame a space that will become, it's not quite done yet, the kind of living room for the city as it intersects with the museum. So you can see that here. In other places, like in China, this is China Central Television in Beijing, we've also used structure to create a kind of building that is a kind of bridge, creating a loop within a building that also simultaneously frames a public space. In this case, a public park that allows the public to engage with China's largest broadcaster. Also at Milstein Hall at Cornell, we also use structure to help us engage with and transform a series of existing buildings. So again, a cantilever, but one that allows students actually to engage the building and between buildings in a new way, and to make something that feels very urban in a setting that's decidedly not urban. We're also currently doing another bridge in Bordeaux, France, that, like this bridge, really looks at not only creating an infrastructural connection or a pedestrian connection, but really a space where where different kinds of activities can take place all throughout the year. So the form of this bridge, the 11th Street Bridge, is something we wanted to be both iconic, but also very simple and rational. So it launches from either side of the river, from the Capitol Riverfront and Anacostia, and meets in the middle. So one platform from either side intersecting to make a space where the two sides can come together and people can do a whole host of things. That iconic X form is very rational in a lot of ways, and we utilize it to make a space where different things can happen. So at first, the structure, so the space between the two X's is stitched together with steel to form a cantilever bridge. This is a test, not with me and Hallie, but predates us. So it allows a very lightweight and efficient structure, and for us to build out over those existing piers without new false work in the river. That height that you get at either end of this X also allows you, when you're on the bridge, to locate yourself within the city. If you go out on the bridge today, where there's actually currently two platforms that go out onto the existing piers, you have a real present sense of the river, but you don't have a sense of where you are in DC at all. You can't see Anacostia, you can't see Capitol Riverfront. So we want to change that. Also, that the thickness that's created by that X gives us a space where we can create different kinds of programs. So like the Rialto Bridge, which is here in Venice, we can load the bridge with different kinds of activities and programs. So transforming a known typology to something else. So within that, there's a performance space that's embedded within the bridge, a central plaza, cafe, and also an environmental education center that will all be housed as programmable spaces all along the bridge. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Hallie.
This project has been a wonderful culmination of a lot of the topics and typologies that OLIN enjoys working on. Our passion is really creating places that enhance life in the urban environment. Oh, I'm sorry. Like the Canal Park, which is in the Capitol Riverfront area that you see in the upper left, we love to work on neighborhood parks and plazas. We've done some ecological restoration work up in Kennicott with the Stamford Mill River Park community. And then we're probably best known here in DC for our work on the Washington Monument and a new project called the Sylvan Theater adjacent to the Washington Monument, which is a future project for the Trust for the National Mall. And then as well as our work on the National Gallery of Art Sculpture Garden. But in essence, for us, we know we've been successful when you see an image like the one in the lower left, where we see people from all walks of life coming together and enjoying life in the city. For this project, we really looked to take a step back and look at the larger scale to understand where Washington as a city is situated in the physiographic regions of the hilly topography of the Piedmont. We're right here at the fall line, and where it meets the flatness of the coastal plain. We learned in our research that the Anacostia River really extends well beyond the reaches of the district, as you can see on the image on the right. The fact that its watershed is in fact largely in the state of Maryland and 176 square miles. We have learned, sadly, that its health is greatly challenged, that of the Anacostia River, and that it has 3 sources of pollution currently. The non-point source pollution, or stormwater, that runs off largely in its upper reaches from the state of Maryland, as well as the areas in yellow that you see denoting contaminated soils and sediments. And then, of course, DC, the combined sewer system here, on days of heavy rains, literally dumps sanitary sewage into the river on a daily basis. The city is working very hard now to promote a tunnel project which will cure that ill, but we have the other 2 to contend with moving forward. However, in the upper reaches of the river, there's some lovely places. Some of the rowers on the river call this the Narnia portion of the river. And it's this idea of plantings and plant communities which support wildlife and keep the river healthy that we want to promote and bring down towards the mouth of the river in our site location. So as a landscape architect, we often look to the larger landscape, the landscape communities or plant communities that support a variety of wildlife and are deployed on the bridge and terra firma based upon elevation and access to water. Certain plants like their feet wet and certain plants do not. What this allowed us to do in this project is to capture, cleanse, and reuse stormwater on the deck itself, to filter water as it moves across the land on both sides before it reaches the river itself, and then to clean the river with demonstration wetlands around the piers at the base of the bridge. So it's a number of ecological strategies that we have in mind here, involving also an environmental education center, really to teach the city of Washington and the greater nation that we must attend to our urban rivers. They're a vital life force in our communities, and how a number of strategies will be deployed here in order to bring the health back to the Anacostia. So it's really a chance to spotlight these issues and also all of the great work that's been done to date by groups such as the Anacostia Watershed Society, Anacostia River Keeper, and numerous others. At the same time, the program called for addressing public health needs. Wards 7 and 8 have some of the highest rates of obesity in the city on the Anacostia side. And so we work to connect to the river trails that exist on either shore, but also to create this loop that you can see on the bridge proper, a half-mile loop, as well as putting forth ideas about urban agriculture and programs involving the cafe that will pick up on some great work by DC Blossoms and other groups around the city that educate children and the public about healthy eating and things of that sort. So finally, we wanted to create a place that was going to be vibrant and alive year-round, particularly in fall. And we thought, like the Cherry Festival, perhaps this bridge park has a fall festival for its color. And this just gives you an idea of walking across. This is the entrance from Anacostia. We felt it important to put forth a neighborhood park on this side. This gives you a sense of the river's edge with the bridge beyond, the opportunity to kayak and canoe. On the Anacostia side, we put the play area, which is not only for children but also energetic adults. And then as one walks across, connecting down to the Navy Yard and using works of art or art programs to further embellish the landscape. But I think ultimately we're creating a place of exchange. This central plaza, which we called Anacostia Plaza, harkens back to the history. The Indians called this place Anacostia because it was a trading place in their culture. So we thought that was a nice idea to pick up on.
Thank you all. It's a great overview of the project. Maybe before we get into some of the more complicated things, just ask a few questions about the design. And as Scott was giving his introduction, he said that in fact the piers are that's where the real investment infrastructurally is in a bridge. I hadn't thought of that. But I'm wondering, from a design point of view, do you look at those piers as an asset or as the thing you have to work around? If you were to do this in a kind of, tabula rasa form, would you work with pre-existing piers in the way that this project has come to you?
Well, I mean, if we had everything we wanted, then for sure we would have a little more flexibility. But I think that the fact that we have to deal with the existing bridge piers is actually a very good restraint on us. I think in a lot of, there's a lot of bridge building happening for pedestrian bridges, not so much here, but if you look at London and other places. And the fact that we need to work with those existing conditions, not to mention the conditions on either side, actually makes us do something that's quite simple in a lot of ways. So in the end, I think it was beneficial to the project that we do have to use them. And it certainly, as Scott said, from a cost standpoint, is a big benefit.
Yeah, and I think also we were able to show this idea of floating wetlands so they can be attached to those piers and sort of pull off of that, while at the same time maintaining that waterway open for the Coast Guard, but also all of the rowers that use the river today, and kayakers too.
But tell us a little more about the floating wetlands, would sound really, really fascinating, and kind of what they'll look like, how you're going to construct them, and do you have any sense of how much of an actual environmental impact they can have on the river?
Well, they can have a very significant impact. Unfortunately, what happened back in the 30s, the Army Corps of Engineers, given the technologies and ideas of the time, put forth this idea of hardening the edge of the Anacostia. So I think what we've learned today, more recently, that we need to have these planted edges that take up the flood waters and are more resilient. We've been working on a project in New York, Rebuild by Design, as has OMA, that deals with that issue of sea level rise and things of that sort. But I think at the same time, these wetlands can be wonderful places for people to commune with nature and learn about the flora and the fauna.
And will that involve actually building some kind of platform away from the existing piers, or will the wetlands be incorporated in some kind of shell or mesh or something? Physically, what's that going to be like?
Right, they will have a structure to them, and then they would be attached to the piers. But on the terra firma side, on the Anacostia, we envision sort of replenishing the existing, what was the existing section there, a series of plants, and as one grows closer to the water's edge, those that can take that inundation of water from time to time.
Right. And just from looking at the pictures and some you've shown, how close can I get to the river if I'm on this bridge? Can I dip my finger in the river? Am I going to be able to lean over and stare at my reflection in the river? What's the actual tangible relationship?
Well, we're looking at, but when you're on the bridge itself, you can't dip your toe in, or if you do, things have gone wrong. But we're looking at, you can see here, even actually creating a kind of boat dock on the Anacostia side. So I think the Anacostia side of the river has a lot more opportunities to really get down close to the river itself. There's already a kind of soft shore there all along the national park. So it's really there that we're trying to engage you with the water. And then on the bridge itself, we're utilizing at either end kind of waterfall features that really bring water into the bridge, onto the life of the bridge itself, even if it's not the river water per se.
Right, we'll have 2 waterfalls on either end, which will again demonstrate how plants in particular can cleanse water and give people the opportunity to reach out and touch it. That would be, a closed loop system of clean water. But then beneath the bridge, we're proposing another waterfall that demonstrates the need for aeration in this river. That's one of the key issues, is the lack of oxygen levels.
Okay. So, Scott, there's a lot of stuff to accommodate on this bridge now, and this emerged out of, as you were saying, public hearings. Tell me a little bit more about how you came up with a manageable, coherent idea of what this space was capable of doing. How did you sort of will it down to the various functions that then became part of this design?
Yeah, you bet. In the hundreds of meetings that we had with thousands of the residents on both sides of the river and increasingly around the city, what was most fascinating to me, and this wasn't something that I expected, was that we kept hearing the same ideas come up again and again. It might have been articulated in different ways, but that need for water access, to get down and touch the water, was key. And particularly, I came across this great quote the other day by Jacques Cousteau, who said, "We protect what we love," right? And unless we get down to the water, we can't really get to know it and protect it and love it. So that was a key notion. This idea of a performance space was actually the #1 thing that came up again and again from residents on both sides of the river. That can build social capital. The inspiring the next generation of river stewards and environmental education center was key. Respecting where this is, making sure it responds to the history of both sides through public art, through the Navy Yard on one side and historic Anacostia on the other. I mean, the history is amazing. Frederick Douglass used to walk across this bridge every single day on his way to work, right? How do we make sure we capture some of those stories? So we collected all these ideas, that we kept hearing those same ideas come again and again, and then before we launched the design competition, we held a series of charrettes on both sides of the river saying, here's what we've been hearing, these 5 or 6 key ideas. Are we right? Did we miss something? Help us prioritize them. We had well over 100 people participate in both those half-day charrettes, one in Matthews Memorial Baptist Church on the Ward 8 side and then by the Navy Yard. And interestingly, again, everyone said, no, you heard us right. It's you're spot on. Finally, it was key that the community continued to be engaged throughout the design competition process. As I understand it, it's typical for design competition for the final designers that have been shortlisted not to have any real connection with the community, more or less the client, which just didn't make sense to us. So we created what we called the Design Oversight Committee. So these were the community stakeholders from both sides of the river that reviewed the design brief before it went out to the public. So that was one last sort of check to make sure that the community was responding to this. They met with the designers multiple times over the summer to make sure that they were continuing to help the designers fine-tune and when I see the final design, it has the Design Oversight Committee's fingers sort of on it, the fingerprints. And then finally, the design committee met at the end to use the same criteria that the jury did, and miraculously, they were completely unanimous with the jury. So I think it was this iterative process of continuing to go out again and again, and I think that the last thing I'll say is what was really critical for that is I think particularly in the communities east of the river, there is an enormous trust deficit, right? And that's justifiable because there's people that have made a lot of promises east of the river, and either they show up at a community meeting, check the box, and they never see each other again, or they get value engineered out. So making sure that the only way that we've solved that is through trust. And trust is shared experiences over time. So it kept showing up again and again and making sure that the community knew that they were driving this process.
So one of the things that's really kind of wonderful from a symbolic point of view of this process is that the infrastructure of the bridge really is kind of historically related to some of the problems the bridge is meant to address. I mean, this is a bridge that helped people get out of Washington, D.C., help them get to suburbs where they sort of lived in their cars, where sidewalks became sort of antiquated thing of memory. It helped create things like food deserts. And these are all issues that the bridge is meant to address. But tell us a little bit about the 2 neighborhoods that are on either side of it and how the health issues kind of map onto those 2 neighborhoods.
Yeah, the communities on either side of the river, the Capitol Hill and Navy Yard on one side, and then historic Anacostia and Fairlawn on the other side of the river, although they're 1,000 feet apart, could not be more different when you look at sort of any different criteria. And I think that's particularly powerful when you look at the health statistics. Hallie mentioned that the Ward 8, for instance, has the highest rate of obesity in the city, actually in the country, 41.9% adult obesity rate. Ward 7 is a 39.9% adult obesity rate. Lowest access to fresh fruits and vegetables. The first grocery store opened up in Ward 8 in 2006, right? Served 74,000 people in that ward. It's extraordinarily powerful. The first sit-down restaurant in IHOP, opened up in 2006, right? There's more that are sort of coming up, but I think we see that lack of investment. I think we see on a range of criteria, whether it's homeownership versus renters, whether it's the unemployment, whether it's child poverty levels, there's a huge divide. And I think that ultimately, when we talk about the key goals for the project, I think that's why the one goal that I think most viscerally connects to people is that sort of physical and metaphorical bridge that sort of links both sides.
So let's talk about the specific things that the bridge can do health-wise, and maybe from a design point of view. Is this mainly an inspiration? Is this a place to play? Is this a pathway? How does it relate to actually dealing with issues of nutrition and physical activity?
Well, it does connect. There are existing, as I said, there are existing riverwalk trails on either side, but there's no way to connect from one side to the other, clearly. But those trails follow the river all the way in up to Bladensburg, so they're incredible bicycle paths that many cyclists are using. I think the more populated this area becomes, you'll see more and more of that use. We mentioned the little dock under the environmental center, which starts on the top of the deck and then reaches down to the ground. That would allow people to rent canoes or kayaks to actually get out on the water. This loop, this half-mile loop, would promote walking at a minimum, but also we had the play area for the children, and then we had some adult play areas adjacent to the cafe. This wonderful idea that OMA had of these sort of nets that hang down so that one can get out over these play nets, they were calling them, and engage all ages throughout. So, but I think also this program at the cafe, having a demonstration urban agriculture adjacent to the cafe will be critical too. Again, like the ecological strategies, this is really sort of a chance to spotlight some of these programs that are going on in the district now, and then highlight some of the issues and the need to do more moving forward.
If I could add one thing to that, is that the urban agriculture was something that we heard from the community again and again of a required the programming as part of that. And I now know how much dirt you need for fruit trees. They're really heavy, and it was probably impractical. I had visions when we started this of like, oh, a fruit orchard, and that's not going to work. So we see the urban agriculture less of community garden spaces as more of a backdrop for healthy cooking classes, for planting festivals, for harvest festivals, for CSA drop-off points, for the farmers markets. And we're actually talking right now, we've had extensive conversations with the University of District of Columbia who are keenly interested in helping to activate that space and let the urban agriculture area be that sort of backdrop for the awareness of, to increase food literacy itself.
Since you mentioned the difficulty putting in orchards, I thought I would ask Hallie a question that's been in the back of my mind for a long time. We've seen projects like this. The High Line is a classic one. Are we learning anything about kind of what you can successfully grow and what needs a lot of tending and what is kind of sustainable when you plant on a structure like this?
Certainly. Really, OLIN has a legacy of designing landscapes over structure, and we've been doing it, I would say, for 40 years, going all the way back to our work on the Docklands in London and Canary Wharf. So we've learned a lot about different technologies. Simply put, one needs 4 foot of soil depth on the deck. So in working with OMA and Jason's team, we worked to locate the trees very carefully that we were proposing on the bridge proper, with the eye of also providing the badly needed shade in this area. We all know how DC has these sultry summers in July and August in particular. And so between the expression of that X form as well as the plantings, the idea was to improve the microclimate here and provide comfort. But the answer is yes, we understand how to achieve those ends, but in this case, the voids in the design are countered by the plantings that you see here too. It helped with the structure, and we probably should mention our structural engineer, Matt Larson here.
Yeah, from Arup, we work with on the, it's a real balancing act on this kind of structure, because we do have just the existing piers, trying to create a robust landscape and vary that in a way that you can actually be supported by the piers is really one of the key challenges of the project.
Well, let me ask about that, because one of the really exciting things about this, from a visual point of view, is you have this X crossing, and then these two things seem to be rising like wings up there, but that they don't just float there magically. How are you going to, how big a structural challenge is it to support that, and how do you accomplish that?
Oh, well, it's actually pretty easy
Oh,
because
good.
because there's a lot of columns.
One
I mean,
question.
there's a kind of the diagonal bracing that I showed that'll actually work to support the bridge will also support those either end.
So they're not really cantilevered,
They're not cantilevered. No, the bridge is cantilevering out towards the middle, and that's where it touches. So it can thin out as it has less and less load to bear and can touch in the middle. And that also lets us, Hallie mentioned earlier, there's a kind of minimum clearance for the Coast Guard and things like that. So, but also even if you look at the form of the bridge itself, one side is actually open and shelters and provides support for the performance space, which is right below it. And then the other side, towards Anacostia, is actually more of a roofscape that provides a canopy for shade for the times, most of the time when that's needed here. Not so much lately, but anyway. And then there's a cafe below that. So, and then that's all simply supported.
Okay. And in looking at the slides that you showed, maybe this is a question for everybody if they wanted to take a chance at it. I get two very different senses of the bridge. One is a very, very active space, very social space, playgrounds, meeting grounds, and then the other is, you know, individuals walking among trees, walking on grass, kind of in their own space. Is this going to be both? Can it be both? Is there a kind of governing idea of what this thing is going to sound like and feel like when it's finished and you're on it?
Well, I think indeed it can be both. I think right now the wonderful aspect of this is creating this park that's hovering over the river itself. If one goes out there today, despite the sort of awkward catwalks that are there, at the time of the sunset, it's really quite breathtaking as it is. So I think there was this desire to, at one hand, use program to be an attractor and make this a regional draw as well as local draw, but at the same time provide for various times of day or times of the year where one can simply enjoy the river itself and all that's passing by, whether it be the birds flying by or the boaters going by on the river itself. So.
I think we have the breadth and the length to accommodate a lot of different kinds of things. I mean, we want it to be, I think, more active than passive, but you know, one of the things we looked at the very beginning was the notion of whether this was more like a pier or more like a bridge. And you know, if you look at piers, I mean, I'm living in New York, so I know like Brooklyn Bridge Park recently was built, or all the piers and activity that's taking place along the Hudson in New York. On a pier like that, you actually get activity and people resting, people watching movies on the piers, people doing all kinds of things, versus a bridge or something like the High Line where it's often about more of a passage. So we want activity more than traversing, but it's also, of course, people coming from both sides and crossing too. So.
Let me ask Scott about something that I guess is almost now known by the name as the sort of the High Line phenomenon. And that is when you invest the resources into a park like this or a project like this, and it's successful, it has an enormous impact on economic development, the price of land, the kinds of businesses that are in the vicinity. It can radically transform a neighborhood. And that's all great, except for the fact that that neighborhood can then become so expensive that I can't live there. What's going into your thinking in terms of that phenomenon? Do you just accept it as inevitable, bring it on, or do you have thoughts of how we can kind of manage that?
That's a really good question and really important. We've been spending an awful lot of time thinking about this. As you point out, Phil, we know that signature parks can increase property values by anywhere from 5 to 40%, or in the High Line's case, I think it was 103%, right? 5 million, close to 6 million visitors the last year of the High Line alone. Tremendous success, $2 billion of economic impact. And that's great, but how do we ensure that the thousands of people that have helped shape this project from the beginning can be the ones that benefit from it the most? Really important. And I think we've seen here in Washington, D.C., a tremendous amount of I think what's known in the press is sort of the G word, right? Gentrification. We choose not to use that word just because it's so politically charged. It's hard to have a conversation around gentrification. But what we're really talking about when we speak about gentrification is displacement. Affordable housing displacement, economic displacement, cultural displacement, right? So timing is everything. Timing is really critically important. How do you make sure there are policies in place before that speculation begins that can help mitigate that displacement and ensure it can be inclusive development? Once the market takes over, it's almost too late, right? It moves so much faster than we can respond to. So to that end, we've created back in the fall, recognizing this is important and timing is everything, what we're calling an equitable development task force. So these are senior scholars from the Urban Institute, LISC DC, the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, and the Office of Planning, who are working with us to create a series of policy recommendations, and I'll give a couple examples what those might be, that can be put in place before that speculation begins. They've helped us pull together a brainstorming session with about 35 different experts of the Department of Employment Resources and Office of the Tenant Advocate, the Enterprise Community Foundation, lots of really smart folks. We met in February and had a 6-hour brainstorming session, and they came up with some phenomenal ideas that might include the city's been land banking property east of the river in particular for generations. How do we make sure that the government holds on to that land that gives them much more control over the standard 8 or 10% inclusionary zoning that's mandated if it was in private hands? That could include a higher percentage of 60% AMI or workforce housing or affordable housing.
Let's back up and flesh out some of the
terms, sure. Sorry. So the currently, and I'm learning so many things about so many things working on this project. Let me tell you, if a parcel was in private hands for I think it's over 40 or 41 units, 8 or 10% of those units need to be maintained for affordable housing. At a certain percentage of the mean income. I think a great example of this is up in Columbia Heights, where the district owned most of the parcels around the future metro station that allowed them to have a much higher percentage of affordable housing units in those sort of 3 different parcels. The 4th was the new target that went in and helped drive that development. Is this an opportunity for us to have more extensive links and collaborations with the local high schools? The Anacostia High School is just up the street that provides job workforce training. Is this an opportunity for us to think about partnerships with the DC Central Kitchen, for instance, to run the cafe or restaurant that could be job training? How do we look at, one of the big challenges is if we're about to spend lots of money building this park, how do we make sure that those jobs then go to the local residents and that those local residents have the training that they need to succeed at those jobs? We have 2 years before construction, so this is a wonderful opportunity to partner with the Ward 8 Workforce Council, the Jubilee Jobs, and others to make sure that that training is sort of ready to the point when we're able to have those the jobs to come online. We recently announced a significant grant from a New York-based foundation, the JPB Foundation, to help support this effort, to take these concepts and ideas to our community stakeholders, to a series of public meetings that we'll have by the early fall an actionable plan for equitable and inclusive development. I was speaking to a journalist at the Post, actually, a colleague of yours, Phil, and talking about this our equitable plan, and he was done with my sort of spiel, and there was silence on the phone, and I said, "Jonathan, are you there?" And he's like, "Scott, 2 years ago when you described this Bridge Park thing, I thought you were nuts. Like, I thought you were totally crazy, and this is never going to happen. Now I know that the Bridge Park's going to happen." But what you're describing is even more difficult than building a bridge. Right? But it's critically important, because if we build a new civic space that then pushes out the people that have helped shape it, in no uncertain terms have we failed. Right? So we're going to make some mistakes, I'm sure, but again, timing is everything, and we encourage everyone to help us shape this plan as we move forward.
I realize you're at the point of having created this committee to look into it, so I can't really press you for specific answers, but the land bank idea sounds wonderful. The city takes over, buys these properties, holds them until the values go up, and then they can either drive a harder bargain when it comes to affordable housing, or they can sell the land for uses that they want to encourage, say cultural usages. That's all great, except we're talking about Washington, D.C. And, administrations change, and once an asset becomes valuable, suddenly somebody wants to kind of use it in the pay-to-play politics of the city. Is there any thought of having you or somebody who's not the city, in a sense, in charge of what's land banked, so that there can be a kind of ongoing oversight about how it gets used?
So that's a great question. We've been following very carefully the work of Atlanta's Beltline. I don't know if people know about the Beltline project. The larger project, they're taking an old railroad and making about a 32-mile loop of green space around the city. Much bigger project, multi-billion dollars. But they recognized, they had an equitable development plan right from the beginning. And we've talked to their staff. They've been extraordinarily helpful in helping us to learn from their lessons. And they came to the conclusion that land ownership was so important that they actually created their own community land trust. Because they knew where development was going in, they could purchase up that land when it's inexpensive, and then give them much more control over what happened. I don't know if we're going to do that, but I think we've already been talking to community land trusts. That again, timing is everything, right? How do you avoid something the development that's sort of sprung forth almost overnight of NOMA, that's great and it's wonderful, but the city council just devoted $50 million to build a park there, half of which was for land acquisition, right? So $25 million for land acquisition. So how do you, those solutions don't go away when speculation begins, they just become much more expensive, and then those solutions get fewer and fewer. So sort of timing is everything. Long way of saying, we see that this is a potential not to solve all of the city's ills. We need to make sure that we're setting realistic expectations, but we do think that this can be a catalyst for these larger issues of workforce development, of small business enterprise, of affordable housing that can be rather ephemeral, that the city's been struggling with for generations. This can be a catalyst for how we're thinking about it, at least in the adjacent neighborhoods.
Before we go to questions, to put in perspective one thing you said, and that is the city spent $25 million to acquire land in NOMA to create a park, and the budget for your entire project is?
So we're looking at a larger capital campaign of $45 million that is comprised of several different items: hard construction costs, pre-construction costs, construction management, and then a $10 million endowment. The city has committed $14.5 million, so about half of some of the hard construction costs. Somehow that number never goes down, right? And so one of our first tasks is actually working with an outside consultant to get a much sort of finer grain on what that dollar amount's going to be. But I think that this is an opportunity to think about not only as a philanthropic endeavor, but an investment. And that's so important that we actually hired an outside economic development consultant, HR&A advisors, one of the best in the business, to go and do a economic development analysis of what kind of investment would this return. And it's significant. I mean, we hired them last summer before we had a final design, but it's in the tens of millions of dollars every year. It's up on our website at bridgepark.org. You can see it. But I think framing this as an investment in the city is critically important.
Great. Let's have questions from the panel. If you're at the table, I think you use the button on the microphone. So we'll start here, and then I think there's probably a microphone, we can walk back to you there. But why don't we start here?
Hi, I'm Joanna Brignolo. My question, and thankfully this image is still here. I live in Southwest DC, which is now being developed with tremendous high-rises coming. So what I'm seeing here, and I'm saying, my God, all this land is this is the park, and that is definitely never going to be violated with buildings, or is that going to find, like we have in New York, the beautiful development that's going on the Hudson? Are we going to see some structures there that the people themselves, because the people in my area demanded and asked for? They says, if there's going to be housing on this water, I want to have a chance to live there. And by goodness, the people in Anacostia have a right to be there. And I wondered if we're going to have some of the, like the beautiful barge boats that could be possibly there to have dinner cruises and things like that. I see a vast opportunity here.
So as a way to activate the water, certainly the Odyssey and sort of other boats currently go up the Anacostia,
Yes.
which is fabulous. They can go up.
Yes, but they could dock here too. It would be wonderful.
Absolutely.
I think.
Then how do we, as Phil mentioned sort of at the beginning of the conversation, and then I'll get to your sort of land ownership question, one of the reasons why we were founded here as the nation's capital is because we were at the confluence of the Potomac and the eastern branch of the Potomac, now what we know as the Anacostia River, and I find it really fascinating that we don't define ourselves as a river city, right? I think that's really interesting. And the river is stunning. The river, and particularly the Anacostia, I kayak on the river on a pretty regular basis. There's a pair of nesting bald eagles at the Arboretum, right? That when you're kayaking on the river and you see a bald eagle flying over your head in the nation's capital, like that is a transformative experience. I've seen what I thought was the largest rat that I've ever seen before in my life, until I saw its tail, and it was a beaver. There's a healthy beaver population that lives in the Anacostia River, right? How do we, it goes back to that quote, we protect what we love, right? We need to love something, we need to get people down there, and we have done a phenomenal job of putting as many barriers as we can between humans and the waterfront. That's changing, but that's certainly a key goal of this project. The land, as this approaches in the historic Anacostia or Ward 8 side, is currently flanked with the 2 National Park Service properties. So to the north, between the 11th Street Bridge and the Pennsylvania Avenue Bridge, that's Anacostia Park, so that's a National Park Service. The south is also the National Park Service between the 11th Street Bridge and the South Capitol Bridge. That area is known as Poplar Point. So that area, the legislation was passed in 2006 to transfer that property to the district. As the legislation is written and was signed by then President Bush, it's a 110-acre parcel. 70 acres will remain as green space. 40 acres will be developed into mixed use. They're actually currently working on a small area plan right now. We're going to build the bridge before anything happens down there. But I think that is important to think about how this bridge park can be a catalyst for that development and can integrate into that overall planning. And the last thing I'll say is an invitation. One of the ways that one of the pieces of advice we heard from people at the High Line and Brooklyn Bridge Park and the Beltline is don't wait until we open in 2018, which is the earliest we could open. But get people down to the site now, early and often. Normalize that behavior of getting people down to the river and test, pilot, and evaluate programming ideas. So to that end, we're partnering with the National Park Service and the National Cherry Blossom Festival to hold the first annual Anacostia River Festival, April 12th, so in about 3 weeks. We're building an 80-foot floating dock in the river, and it's going to be bands, bike parades. It's going to be phenomenal. So come on down.
Great. Let's get somebody from the back of the audience first. There in the red. Perfect.
Actually, Phil, I think you asked a lot of my questions, but I just want to bring up a couple of resources. One is Fishing in the City, which is a film that was done in the 1980s. It's at the Humanities Council of Washington, D.C., which is a story of sort of the people who fished out of the water, which can't do now. But I also wanted to ask, I lived in Anacostia for 13 years, and I noticed we did lose a grocery store in the early 80s, and also a small restaurant which was run by a schoolmate's family that was there. So things just kind of started leaving in the 80s, and now people are looking at the neighborhood again. But I would like to know, with this bridge, the 11th Street project, which jurisdiction will it be under? With the council, who would be the council member for the bridge? And also, what is the strategy or the plan for the maintenance so that it'll be here for a long time?
Those are great questions. Two of the things that keep me up, well, that's not true. Lots of things keep me up at night. But two of the main things that keep me up at night are, one, long-term flexibility. So how do we make sure that the space can continue to adapt in 30 years when we're all dancing with holograms or whatever we're doing? Like, how can we make sure that the space can be flexible? And I think Jason and Hallie have done a wonderful job of providing that flexibility in there. But two is long-term financial sustainability. So I think we've got a wonderful model, the organization that's been leading this at building bridges across the river at the Arc, that those who might not know the Arc, it's a 110,000 square foot facility that has 10 different nonprofit partners, the Washington Children's Medical Center, Washington Ballet, Levine School of Music, Boys and Girls Club, Covenant House. And we're looking at following a very similar model so that the programming would be partnering with other nonprofits to provide that programming. So we're talking to Anacostia Watershed Society to help manage and run the Environmental Education Center. Washington Performing Arts to help manage the outdoor performance space. UDC, as I mentioned, is keenly interested in running the outdoor urban agriculture the place. And that's key because most importantly, we're tapping into the expertise of these nonprofits, but that they're also bringing human capital, and resources to the table, which is important, so it can be active. And then we're looking at a long-term strategies of how do we ensure there's as many revenue streams as possible. That's the thing that folks at the High Line, Brooklyn Bridge Park, and everybody else has mentioned to us. So a $10 million endowment could provide $500,000 a year. We think there's rental the facilities, a significant amount of rental the income that could be coming in. How do we capture some of the value that we're bringing to the community? So it's a long way of saying, in the conversations that we've had with the city, is that DDOT, who currently owns the bridge, the city, the land has been transferred from the federal government to the district. That's already happened. Would then lease the space, for $1 a year for the next 50, 75 years to building bridges across the river at the Arc that would then manage and run this in collaboration with all these other nonprofits. I will have to get back to you on which jurisdiction this will be under, because we're over the river, which the river bottom is run by the National Park Service. The sides are run by the Army Corps of Engineers. The channel itself is run by the U.S. Coast Guard, and then it's Ward 6, 7, and 8 on both sides. So it's lots of different partners that we're playing with, and all of which, and don't forget the Navy Yard, that 15,000 workers come to work there every single day. All of which, I should add, love this project and are working very closely with us to make sure it's moving forward. But I'll get back to you on that.
So up right here.
Couple of questions. The first one is, have you, I don't know how you measure the noise levels, if that's going to be full of cars on top. That's question one. Could you please elaborate on that? Secondly, you're bringing communities together, and you've got two very different economic groups that you're trying to pull together. I believe that's what's going on here. And if you look at the structure of your design, it's a perfect skateboard opportunity. And I'm not kidding here. I actually have seen, even recently, as recently as last week, I'm from California. Skateboarding and surfing really is from there. It started worldwide now. And I'm seeing kids from across that park with kids from better neighborhoods, let's say, and they're integrating in that way. Do you have any possibility of putting a skate park in there?
So I'll take the skate park idea first, and then if you want to talk a little bit about noise, with the acoustic engineers. When we went out and asked the residents what is it that they would like as part of the programming, we heard lots of different ideas. The 5 or 6 key ideas were the same ideas we heard again and again, but one of the issues is it was important to make sure that as we were asking for ideas, at the same time we did an amenity study. So to see which, are there existing, one of the ideas, for instance, that came up was a roller skating rink. But there's a roller skating rink that's in Anacostia Park that's less than a mile away. So that meant that would be duplicative, right? There's an amazing skate park that's actually at RFK Stadium that is within about a mile away. So there's a ice skating rink, that idea came up too, but there's a beautiful new ice skating rink at Canal Park. So we didn't want to be, as we looked at about a 2-mile walk shed of around the park, we didn't want to introduce something that might have already existed in the community. Making sure that we're thinking long-term about the skating and what that can do to the existing infrastructure, I think is going to be important. But biking is going to be really important, and we're working very closely with the biking community. So it's a long way of saying we're not looking at having you could take your skateboard here, but not necessarily, but then also encourage them to go to the RFK skate park. And if you want to tackle the noise, which is critically important.
So, yeah, I think that it's hard to control the skateboarders. That's one of the good and bad things about them. But so the issue of noise obviously is a major component here because there's roads directly adjacent. The one good thing is that the bridge that's directly next to us is actually the local bridge, and there's as Scott mentioned, a bit of a buffer because there's existing pedestrian path on the side facing us as well as the future maybe streetcar. So both of those give us a bit of a buffer, but we've also been working with Threshold Acoustics, an acoustic firm out of Chicago, to try to design the bridge and the different layers of it so that we can partially shield visitors to the bridge from that traffic by blocking line of sight. And then also around the performance space, part of the purpose of this upper deck here is to actually give a space from which we can house the speakers and an array that, like at Millennium Park in Chicago, will help distribute sound and shield you a little bit from the surrounding noise.
Follow up on that. Is noise canceling technology at the point of sophistication that could be used in this kind of space?
It's not really noise canceling so much, but more, the main thing is to block your line of sight. And then if you're playing something amplified, to distribute in a way that you can hear it.
So the technology I have in my Bose earphones, which I can't afford, but
Can't just be kind of spread out
Can't be
into
spread
the
out.
universe. No, not really, not so
There's
well.
no material that can absorb sound when you build?
I think, well, the materiality will be important for helping with that, but, so certainly using softer materials and the landscape itself, kind of important parts of that. But.
And before we go back here for one question, I wanted to ask something that you sort of hinted at in terms of skateboards and so on. Who gets to make the rules for the park? Who gets to decide, can I listen to music on my headphones? Can I listen to my boombox? Can I, how much can I wear? How much can I not wear? What sports and activities? I mean, a park that's got a lot of...
Cats, dogs, lots of...
all this stuff. So,
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. We haven't gotten to that level of detail. But I would imagine that this would operate very similar to a city park, right? One question that we're getting, for instance, is hours of operation, right? So is this open 24 hours a day? Is there something that physically closes, which we don't think there would be? But we would see this would operate very much like a Department of Parks and Rec operated park. It would be very similar to a canal park or yards park, which is on the public land, or at least yards park, but managed by a private entity that follows sort of similar rules to what a general park would be. So.
and then back here, there's a question. If we can get you the mic, that'll help, because I think there may be video recording.
I noticed that the name Rem Koolhaas was not mentioned either in the literature or in the discussion. And even if he did not have a role in designing this project, maybe it would help international and national attention by somehow including him in this so that it could be described as Rem Koolhaas's first Washington project, just as Seattle has made such a big marketing ploy by saying their library is a Rem Koolhaas design. Secondly, I just also wondered when there was discussion on the budget, whether all the concerns about the enormous cost overruns of the other bridge designer, Calatrava, whether that had any role in how do you assure that this won't be another Calatrava cost overrun project?
I know that we intentionally gave a number of budget after talking to the existing bridge designers for nearby that was important, that we didn't end up with a design that the public fell in love with, but that would cost $1 billion and then we'd have no capacity to construct, right? So we did ask for initial cost estimations. But if you want to talk a little bit about both the Rem Koolhaas, but then also I think the design, the engineering of the space was very much intentional, thinking about not only about the visitor experience, but also cost.
Yeah, so I mean, this is no Calatrava, is the kind of simple way to answer that. I mean, it's a very rational and we hope simple, may even get simpler bridge. So our focus is really on creating a platform for activities and for the park itself. So not on kind of excess. So that's that. And then in terms of Rem's involvement or his name, I mean, our firm is a multifaceted firm with 10 partners, and Rem and all of the partners are actually involved, or at least see all of the different projects. But our hope with all our projects is that they're famous, not necessarily because of the name involved, but because of the kind of form and the way that they are active in the city. So I think when we tried to make a bridge that was very simple, also we wanted to make something iconic. So not just for the sake of it, but to give it its proper place as a civic space within DC. So hopefully that comes across.
I'd love to just follow up really quickly, because I'm fascinated by just the architectural part of it and Rem Koolhaas. If you think of Rem Koolhaas, you tend to think of, for instance, that design you showed us, which is the CCTV tower, this enormous building in Beijing. And theoretically, he has stood for a kind of gigantism in architecture. I mean, he's written on this and so on. But your firm is actually doing a lot of these little smaller projects. So what's going on in terms of the firm's identity? How independent is it of his theoretical sense of architecture?
Well, I mean, I think, REM's theoretical work, both before and now, of course, is a huge part of how the firm thinks, how everyone at the firm works. But that's not necessarily, despite his work on bigness, linked to size necessarily. And both Rem himself and all of us are constantly doing projects at every scale. So we design a fashion show, one-off fashion shows for Prada every few months. We do small artist studios. We do giant buildings like CCTV. We do exhibitions. So it's really what we're always looking for are projects that are unique and interesting and in a context that can inspire us and our collaborators to make something unique and exciting. And I mean, this project is definitely one of those. So.
Okay. How about right here, direct in front?
I would like to, Scott, if you would, just like you, to pick up what you said 2 years ago, someone said you're crazy, and now everyone sees it. I think it's visionary. I would really like to hear a little bit more about what gave you this idea. How did you come to it? What was you looking for?
It started actually with the Director of Office of Planning with Harriet Tregoning. She is a complete visionary, and she's now running the Office of Economic Resilience at HUD. The Harriet is sort of a force of nature. And I sort of how I came to this is we were bringing the architect and planner, the Jan Gale, to speak at the Building Museum where I was working at the time, and Jan had never met Harriet, so I connected the two of them for breakfast, and Jan was running a little late, and I asked what I thought was an innocent question at the time, which was, hey Harriet, what's happening with all that construction on the 11th Street Bridge? The beware of innocent questions, because I had no idea I'd be leaving my job and raising tens of millions of dollars, and many years later. But I asked because I live in the neighborhood. My wife and I live at the corner of 9th and I Southeast, so this is my backyard, and this is my neighborhood. But Harriet immediately zeroed in and said, hey, I've got a project for you. I need some help. I've got this idea that she described. It was a thought bubble of an idea that we've really taken and run with it. But I think the more that I started, and I was volunteering on this for about 2.5 years, nights and weekends, when I was working full-time at the National Building Museum, running their education division, I can't think of another project here in the nation's capital that in a single intervention can improve public health, re-engage people with the Anacostia River, stitch together this divided city that's been divided for generations, and be an anchor for economic development. I think that I can't think of another project here in the nation's capital that can do that. And I think ultimately, although it needs to respond to its place, and this needs to be a place that works for the local neighbors, but then also the region, I think that we're in the nation's capital. How do we leverage that we're in the geographic home of the nation's capital that's often talked about as a template for what we should be doing, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so much, but that when 300 mayors are visiting every January as part of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, we can bring them down to this bridge park when it's open and say, don't you have an obesity epidemic in your city? Aren't you looking at ways to activate your long-forgotten river shores? Don't you have man-made or natural barriers that you can learn from that we can continue to move this conversation forward? And I was hooked. So, yeah.
Let's get one last question in here.
This is a simple one. What's the actual distance between, say, the Capitol Hill area and Anacostia? And are you thinking about doing things like walks and races across the bridge?
Yeah, so it is 2 miles from the U.S. Capitol building, is that right? And the bridge span itself is 1,100 feet wide and up to 160 feet. 1,100 feet long and about up to 160 feet wide.
Yes.
Yeah, it's almost the exact footprint of Canal Park, if you're familiar with that, in the Capitol Riverfront. Yeah.
So it's the size of about sort of 3 football fields sort of stacked end to end to end to give you sort of a sense of space. And I think what's really important is that we are using this space to connect a larger constellation of activities on both sides of the river. This can't exist by itself. It needs to be, as I mentioned earlier, deeply stitched into the adjacent neighborhood. So on April 12th on the Anacostia, the River Festival, we are partnering with the Washington Area Bicycle Association, or WABA, to hold river tours, bike river tours, using the park as sort of a central place to go up and down the river. Eventually, that could be larger sort of bike races and runs and walks. Is the intentionality of the walk itself, that loop is a half-mile loop that Jason and Hallie talked about, was very intentional, right? So if you, doing the math, if you walk that 52 times, it'll be a marathon, right? I've done that math.
It's uphill half the time, so it's unique. It's very unique.
But it does. The last thing I'll mention is that the DDOT and the District Department of Transportation and the National Park Service just broke ground last year to continue the Anacostia River Trail that will, by next spring when it opens, will connect from the Bridge Park, or the future side of the Bridge Park, all the way up to College Park, up to Bladensburg. Eventually, you can go all the way up to Baltimore on a single bike trail, which is amazing, right? So making sure this is deeply connected to both sides is really important.
Well, thank you all. This is a really exciting period, I think, in any project. We're at the point where our designers have really given us enough to look at that it kind of has a shape, and the shape is one that's intriguing and appealing, and that icon of the $1,000 bill or the $1 bill or the X dollar bill, we laugh about that, but think how quickly the design for this bridge has taken on a form that can be sort of passed around and is going to be recognizable. It can essentially be branded. That's great. We had a question about, so where did the vision for this come? And that's a great question, but we're actually now at the harder point, right? I mean, the vision's out there, but this is speculation. Everybody's waiting to decide whether this idea is going to be one that you jump in on, right? And that's how so many ideas die in Washington. Somebody comes up with something, but it never quite gets the momentum. Everybody waits to see what's going to happen. The city waits to see, the funders wait to see. I think we're actually at the moment now where it's probably going to happen. I certainly hope it does. And I hope we're all back here or down at the bridge to celebrate its opening in 2018.
And if I can thank you, I think we are at the point where it's not if but when. And I think that's really important. And I think one last thing I'll say, the last comment from me is, how can you help, right? Tell your friends, right? Tell your colleagues. I look around this room and I see the leaders in the business community and the philanthropic community and the government community. There are a tremendous amount of influencers here in the room. Tell your friends and colleagues. Invite us to come speak, right? More than happy to come give a presentation, as we've done many times, to boards, to neighbors, to friends. And finally, now that the weather is getting warmer and winter is behind us, reach out to us. If I can, Irfana, a member of our team, connect with Irfana or me. We'd love to give you a site tour. And we'd encourage you to partner with us on this exciting vision for Washington, D.C.
Thanks so much.